You don't need complex models to create cinematic images. This scene uses simple geometry, minimal textures, lighting and atmosphere doing most of the work. Let's break it down. I started this scene with very simple geometry. No fine detail, no textures, no noise. Just pure brutalist architecture. The idea here was to focus entirely on silhouette and proportion. For this kind of cinematic shots, the model doesn't need to be complex. It just needs to feel heavy and intentional. If the shapes read clearly in grey, everything else becomes much easier later. Before adding any lights, I locked the camera. This shot was designed specifically for a widescreen cinematic frame, a 2.35:1 aspect ratio, which translates to 1920 by 816 pixels for 1080p. The camera is placed low and slightly distant, so the building feels massive and the human feels insignificant. Once this framing is locked, I don't touch the camera again. All the lighting and atmosphere decisions are made to serve this exact view. You can also use the composition guides in Blender's camera to help you with the framing. As you can see, I've used the third camera composition guide to set my frame. Next comes the most important part, lighting. I turned the world completely black to help me with the decisions. I added a large area light off camera to the right to act as my key light. Gave it orangish hue to simulate a polluted city haze. And then I added another area light to the left to act as my fill light. I gave it a slightly lesser saturated orangish yellow color and rotated it to reduce some of the shadows on my building and define the structure better. Then I added a spotlight to simulate the street light in the scene. I increased the power to a high value because otherwise it won't be visible. You can adjust the cone angle. Then I started tweaking the world colors. I added a gradient texture with a color ramp and plugged it in with the color input of the background. I played around with the colors and sliders to create the hazy polluted city look. The gradient texture was also set to diagonal, but you can add a mapping node and use any other gradient if you want. I changed my color ramp sliders. One was bright orange and the other one was a lesser saturated orangish yellow. Then to simulate a cloudy sky, I added a mixed color and plugged in the gradient texture to the A and another noise texture with the color ramp to the B input of the mixed color. You can adjust the noise texture settings. I also changed the noise type to 4D and animated it slightly from 0.1 to 0.4 over the frame range of 720, which gives us a nice evolving cloudy look. I'll turn off all the lights and turn them back on one by one so that you can see the effect the world and the lights are making on the scene. We have our large orange light on the right, illuminating the building and casting a haze over the scene, and some fill light from the left to define the building structure better. This scene is just lit by the world and 2-3 lights, nothing fancy going on. Next up we have the fog. I added a large cube to cover my scene, which would be a localized fog volume. The fog in this scene is doing most of the heavy lifting. I kept the density very low and started with a principal volume shader. You can see that the light paths are very visible now and simulate a real world polluted city. I also increased the world strength a little bit more. Played around with the settings in the principal volume, but I was not very happy with it, so I just switched to a volume scatter by replacing the principal volume with the volume scatter node. Notice that the building fades not because the fog gets stronger, but because it receives less light as it goes into the distance. With the volume scatter on, I tweaked the light strength and settings a little bit. The foreground stays readable, the midground softens, and the background slowly disappears. That separation is what creates depth and scale. Increasing the anisotropy scatters the light more in the direction of the camera, and reducing it scatters it backwards. So for this scene, I didn't change much, I just set it to a value of 0.0055. Materials in this scene are kept extremely simple. There are really just 3 of them. The ground uses a wet asphalt material I've covered in the previous tutorial. You can find the link in the description. I just brought it into this project as is. The building uses a very basic concrete material from Blender kit. Nothing here is custom or complex. I also added a metal material from Blender Kit to the light pole. The goal isn't material realism, it's how the surfaces react to light and fog. They exist to support the lighting, not to draw attention to themselves. If the lighting works, the materials don't need to be impressive. Then we have the particles, texture in the air. This scene actually works without particles. I added them only as a subtle layer of texture in the air. They help catch the light and make the space feel more polluted and alive. There's a simple icosphere with a displacement texture that I used to render the particles. If you can clearly see the individual particles, they're too strong. Ideally, you'll only notice them when they're turned off. I put in a new cube to cover the scene and added a particle system on it. A little bit of turbulence and baked the particles, and there we have the final scene. To push the sense of scale even further, I added very simple building shapes in the distance. These are free models I found online. These aren't meant to be detailed or readable. They exist only to suggest that the city continues beyond the street. Most of the time they are barely visible through the fog. The subtle suggestion helps the main structure feel larger and more oppressive. There's also a free bridge model I put in from Blender Kit. Blender 5.0 has some amazing compositing nodes, but I was gonna do the compositing later in After Effects. But I decided to use the Tune Image node, which lets us change the color of the highlights and the shadows, so I pushed them to be a little bit warmer. This was mainly to make the scene feel more warm and polluted. A lot of the final realism comes together during the compositing stage. I kept this very restrained. Boom on the highlights, some chromatic aberration, lens vignette, haze, and then some color grading. I used Looks by Red Giant to help me achieve this final look. The plugins like Mojo, Colorista, Renoiser, S-Curves, etc. really help put the scene together and make it look more filmic. I also added a bit of clarity to make the buildings look sharper. There's one final step where I added some lens dirt. I didn't need to do it, but I thought it added a little bit more realism to the scene. I imported a lens dirt texture, added a little bit of Gaussian blur on it, used the 3D camera tracker to track my camera movement. Once the camera was tracked, I parented that to the lens dirt layer. Lens dirt in real life would be out of focus and only visible on top of bright lights in the scene. So I drew a mask around the street light and feathered it by a huge amount, about 25 to 50 pixels, and reduced the opacity to make it blend with the scene better. The final image isn't about realism through detail, it's about realism through restrained. Simple geometry, strong lighting, and atmosphere doing most of the storytelling. If this breakdown was useful, I'll be sharing more cinematic studies like this. Thanks for watching and subscribe to Pixel Bender.